Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 113, The Beast Within. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. How you doing today, Mike?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. And what's new in your writing world?
A lot of slacking off. I'm getting distracted with things. Story-wise, I'm still working on Zara 3. Early phases of outlining. I have a sense of what I want the ending to be, and the first few major turns in the story. Still working on like how that fits into, a satisfying climax. So that's like the main thing I'm still struggling with. But mostly just being distracted and not focusing this week, unfortunately. What about you?
I get that.
Yeah.
I've got a few thousand words under my belt. Very happy with that.
Excellent.
Didn't quite jump on like I expected. I was thinking, okay, the 100 days have started. I can just jump in, right? But of course, it takes a while to pivot and then get everything going again. So, but I've started doing that. I'm feeling really good. Lots of productivity. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, good.
So what interesting stories have you come across lately in books, movies, or television?
So after we finished Andor, I had to watch Rogue One, like you said, to complete Cassian's story. And wow, that movie hits so much harder now after going through the Andor series, right? There's so many moments where it's like, this is so much more meaningful than the first time you watch it without all of the backstory.
Yeah.
I think they did a really good job of blending one into the other.
Good.
That was good. Very impactful. And I watched The Continental, which is like a 3-part series, a 3-episode series in the John Wick universe.
Okay.
Which I actually enjoyed more than John Wick, I think. I don't know if you've seen John Wick.
No.
It's basically just him killing people for 2 hours.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah. And The Continental actually has more of a story to it. So it was a lot more interesting to me in that way. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. But definitely Rogue One, I think works so much better for me now.
I watched the next in the Doctor Who series, which is the first one that I think missed its mark of the ones for this season. So I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, it was okay. It wasn't as good as the others, I think.
No, it really wasn't. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm still reading The Way of Kings, which is the first book in the Stormlight Archive, in preparation of reading book 5, which has recently come out. I'm trying to figure out, I have all of my books, the books in the Stormlight Archive so far as paperbacks. But the latest paperback is $35.
Whoa.
And the hardcover is $25. 24 actually. And I'm wondering if I should just buy the hardcover.
That's weird.
It is weird. So I don't know. I don't know. So,
maybe you just have to wait till it comes down to a reasonable price.
I have been waiting. I mean, this was released almost 6 months ago.
What?
Yeah. So I think maybe I'm just going to get the hardcover and just deal with the fact that all my books are not the way they're supposed to be.
Yeah, that's disturbing. You can't have that. It'll have to be
It's
the
gonna
same.
drive me nuts when I see it on the bookshelf, but,
Yeah.
is my sanity worth $10? I don't know. Been such a long time since I read the first book in the Stormlight Archive series that I don't remember a lot of it, or I remember enough of it, so I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I remember this," and it's sort of all so it's been very pleasant to read it again because I don't have all the details down, and so it's like exploring it again, but going
Yeah.
back to a place that's slightly familiar, and I'm able to pay attention to more of the details now because I know some of the things have resonance down the road, later in the story, so it's been fun. It's been
Yeah.
enjoyable. Are you ready to talk about the island of Dr. Moreau?
Sure am. Let's go for it.
Today we're talking about the story told in The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. And I'm going to read the brief summary of the story on Wikipedia. The Island of Dr. Moreau is an 1896 science fiction novel by English author H.G. Wells. The novel is set between the 1st of February 1887 and the 5th of January 1888 and is the narration of Edward Prendick, a shipwrecked man rescued by a passing boat and left on the island home of Dr. Moreau, a mad scientist who creates human-like hybrid beings from animals via vivisection. Did you enjoy this story?
I like this in the sense that I like the three other main H.G. Wells stories. I think there's good and bad to his writing. So I guess it leaves me fairly neutral on his stories. There are a lot of things I like about it. I really like his writing in general. I think in terms of, his sentence to sentence writing, I think his diction is great. He has a very precise use of language, right? He writes in a style that's not, familiar today. And I like that. I like there's something nice about that. I think they used broader vocabulary back then. So it can be a little bit more evocative in that way. So I think that's good. I listened to the book. I think it was the Amazon Classics audiobook. And
Okay.
I thought the narrator did a very good job with it. So I think that helped bring it alive quite a bit. I think H.G. Wells was good at coming up with interesting sci-fi ideas, right? Seen by the fact that they're still making movies and retelling his stories. Not only this one, but like The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, Time Machine, things like that. They've lasted over the decades, century now, I guess. So there's something core to his stories that's interesting. I think he was one of the first to come up with these kinds of ideas. So I think he's really good at those sci-fi ideas. And in this particular story, it's like you said before, it's more of like sci-fi with horror to it, right? And
Yeah.
I do like how he builds up to what is happening. It starts with this shipwrecked guy who's pulled onto another ship and then jettisoned from there. He's kind of bounced around, he's kind of off kilter, right? He doesn't know what's going on even so much himself. And he's out of balance in his life, right? So he's a good person to follow into a horror story where he's kind of not on his normal footing. And the story has kind of a slow build to it that is common among horror type of stories where you don't really know what's going on initially, and then you kind of get bits and pieces as it goes on before really figuring out, okay, here's what's happening. And I like that we get to experience that tension and fear and ultimately disgust that the narrator feels as he learns what's going on. And at first, obviously, Prendick, I think it's Prendick, right? Edward Prendick. He thinks Moreau is twisting humans, right? And once he has that idea, he's trying to escape because, who is he? He's probably going to be the next one experimented on. And I think when you're reading it like me and you don't really know what's the story, I had no familiarity with the story beforehand. I was like, oh, okay, that's what this is about. And then, of course, that's not. He's wrong, although he's close. But, he thought Moreau was going to kill him or mutate him, transform him, vivisect him, whatever. So it's a nice bit of tension-raising misdirection there. Yeah. And then, of course, Moreau's not twisting men. He's twisting animals into men-like creatures, which was still very messed up, very unethical, right? And he's still cold-hearted and rather evil about that. Yeah. So it eases Hendrick's worry of it happening to himself, but the tension of what's going on is still there. So I thought that was pretty cool. I liked the way he set that up and then had a little twist, and yet the evil's still there. I thought that all worked fairly well. And he does a fairly common horror type story thing of stranding someone in a location, right? Once Pendrick realizes what's going on, there's not much he can do about it. He's stuck there, and he's at the mercy of these people and potentially these creatures. So that's like a good horror element, a good horror trope where there's no escape, basically. So I thought that also worked out very well. And I liked at the end that he eventually did escape. It gave us a resolution to the story. Sometimes with these stories, like horror stories, it just ends up bad for everyone involved. Although maybe that's more of a modern horror story type of telling. But still, I thought that was good. It gave us a resolution to the story. I also thought it was amusing that nobody believed him at the end, because why would they, in a sense? Like, what evidence does he have? He's just he sounds crazy, probably. This guy floating in the ocean somewhere that he just picked up. But it also gives a slight possibility for the time that this was written that maybe something like that could have happened in the real world, right? It's just on the edge of believability, but maybe there's some crazy thing like this, right? So I thought that kind of fun from the reader's perspective, when you're like, what if there was someone like Tarzan who was raised by apes, right? Like that kind of thing. So I thought I liked that as well. There's a lot I think could be improved in this story, but we'll get to that. Yeah, so that's kind of the things I liked about the story. There's probably other stuff that I'm forgetting, but those are the main things. A lot of it for me reading H.G. Wells is actually his sentence by sentence writing. I enjoy that because it's a different style, and like I said, it's like his writing is more evocative and he uses a lot of vocabulary. So that's like one of the main things for me. And his idea is cool. What about you?
Okay.
What do you pull from this? What positive do you pull from the Island of Dr. Moreau?
I really liked my favorite point in the book was towards the end when he became, to use your great word, agentive. He, for so much of the book, seemed to be the recipient of all the things happening around him. He didn't do much. He had things done to him. He was rescued. He was saved. He was given. He was shown. All these things that happened to him that he didn't really have a whole lot of control over. But when he started taking control, that's when I really enjoyed the story of the things that he was doing and from his perspective, because this is through his lens, right? It's a first person perspective told in a narrative form. It was much more interesting when he was actually doing something.
I think writing styles have changed over the years, and honestly I think we've just become better at storytelling in some ways.
But one of the things that you saw as the slow build for the horror, which I actually did not enjoy very much, but I don't read that much horror, so I don't recognize that as the way horror is developed in a story. But for me, it actually rang as something a little different, which I thought was kind of interesting. And that was that, his presentation of this story as essentially science fiction, which science fiction was just a very early kind of genre, right? We, let's see, we had Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was early in the century. And then we had Poe, which was not really science fiction, but more horror. Frankenstein did the science fiction and horror thing. Yeah. And then Poe did more horror. And when was Verne? When was Jules Verne?
I think Verne was similar time period to Wells, maybe just before.
Yeah. So we have Jules Verne and his creation of science fiction-y types of stories.
Yeah.
Which was not, I'm looking here, for example, From Earth to the Moon was only 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
So we had Wells kind of, right? So we had Wells kind of doing a blend of the science fiction and the horror, which I don't know if that had been done earlier. I don't know if Verne did anything, was Journey to the Center of the Earth, did that have any horror elements to it?
I don't think so, from what I remember.
Yeah, more adventure. I know 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was more adventurous. Again, I'm not an expert at this, but the other thing that I thought was really fascinating was there was certain sort of psychoanalytical elements to this story. And, Freud had not yet established his theories, but he built his theories on the works of others. And so maybe Wells was aware of the works of the others, because it was just about this time that Freud was starting to develop his theories.
Yeah, it could be.
So I thought that was absolutely fascinating, sort of this conjunction of all these things come together. And for me, this slow build that you say is typical for horror, for me, that was training the reader who may not have known what science fiction was and what science fiction horror was and what science fiction horror with a little psychoanalytical element might have been. And so that's the way it felt to me, was this slow build was kind of orienting the reader who was not going to be otherwise familiar with this genre. And I thought that was well done. But my favorite part was when Prendick became agentive. And that only happened when Moreau died.
Yeah, that's like the end of the book.
Yeah, I know. It's like the last 4 chapters. But all of a sudden, I started really enjoying it in the last 4 chapters.
Yeah, I was only loosely familiar with this story. I'd never read it or seen movies or anything about it.
Yeah.
I just knew it was like some kind of human creature blend type story.
But as far as the theme is concerned, which we're going to talk about shortly, I think that's where the story really shines, in communicating in a wide variety of ways through both showing and telling the theme.
I agree. I think there's a number of different themes in this. So I'll look forward to speaking with you about that too.
So let's talk about what you might have changed as an author.
Yeah.
Now,
okay.
With the understanding that we're coming at this with 100 years of different kinds of storytelling.
Yeah.
That's formulated our storytelling style. So, yeah.
Yeah, a century and a quarter more of writing knowledge. And, he was one of the early people writing in these genres. So, yeah, you got to give him some slack on that. One of the things I would notice, I was talking about, like, I like his sentence to sentence type of writing. I will say, though, he uses the word presently an awful lot. Maybe it's just because I was listening to the audiobook and hearing that guy say that over and over and over again.
Presently? Did the guy have a British accent?
Yeah, he had a British accent.
Yeah.
But so that I would just remove that almost entirely. Things like that. That's a small thing. And, obviously the writing, while it's good wordsmithing, is, it's a bit old-fashioned now. I mean, I kind of like that, but for a modern audience, obviously, I wouldn't write this way. Especially for my YA stories, I try to make it as accessible as possible, so I'm not necessarily trying to go for the wide vocabulary. So that's just a lot of that's genre dependent and the era that you're writing dependent. But while he's good at ideas and actual sentence-to-sentence writing, I don't think he's that great, actually, at execution of a story. And I'm basing that not just on this one. I actually think this is one of the better stories that I read. But if you read, like, Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, Time Machine, they're similar in the sense that they kind of meander and things just happen to the characters. And that's something that you pointed to, right? Where it's like he's not very agentive. I would have wanted to see the main character have wanted something himself. Even if it was interrupted and he got thrust into this story, just so something to get me on board with his character, to feel more concern for his well-being, to want him to succeed, whatever that is, want him to survive, because it's just kind of like following him along. Which, to be fair, a lot of horror stories are that way. Characters get thrust into these situations where they kind of are out of control. But even in that case, they have their own goals, their desires, and they're more active in trying to get out of that situation, to survive that situation, to dominate that situation, to do something, right? I wanted more activity from the main character. And that gives you more narrative drive, when the main character is doing things and actively trying to solve problems. Like you said.
So, like, if he had been like, I'm going to get off this island and, like, constantly scanning the horizon for boats or something.
Yeah, he's trying to light signal fires. He's trying to make a raft. Like you said, all that stuff happens at the end of the story. I think sprinkling some of that throughout The moments where he is more active, like you said, I'm more engaged in the story. When he runs and he tries to go, to the cave where the creatures are to look for help there, for assistance, like that's more interesting, right? He's doing something and you're kind of along with him. But as it is now, he's just kind of mostly along for the ride of events that are happening to him, which is okay as long as there's more active reaction to that for me. Even in the climax of the story, he doesn't really take part in the climax. It just happens, right? Moreau gets killed off screen. It's not until he goes after him, he's like takes the first steps there. Like, I'm going to find out what happens, what's happened, and I'm going to go after them. I'm going to bring the gun. Then you're like, okay, yeah, like you said, you're more engaged with the character at that point. I wanted to see more of that throughout. If he had inspired the beasts to rebel at the end, that would have been more interesting, right? Because he kind of tried to do that at the beginning. If he had brought that to the climactic moment, like he tries to do this, then it would like help convey the theme more, right? It would connect with what the story is trying to say, as opposed to something just happening to someone else. So yeah. I think there's a lot of elements like that could have been amped up if he had just been more agentive.
I agree.
Yeah. So that's my biggest thing kind of throughout the story. And like I said, that's fairly common with H.G. Wells stories from what I remember. Stuff's kind of happening. Like War of the Worlds, the character's just trying to survive. He's not really, he doesn't have a goal other than keep from getting killed by aliens. That's about it. What about you? What things would you improve? What other things? Because we already, kind of hit some of them.
And I agree with you on that. I think the only thing I would add is that I would have liked to have had a little bit more about Dr. Moreau.
Yes.
And I think it would have been really cool if Dr. Moreau first came across as somebody incredibly sophisticated and polished, and that Prendick sort of eased into the mystery and the horror. He's in Dr. Moreau's home instead of in a shack next to the vivisection room, in the home, in a guest room, yeah. And just, a little bit more, easing us into the horror instead of just right away with the screaming and the blood and the yuck. So that's, I think, would have added to that. Now, again, this is the first foray, as far as I know, because I'm not an expert in this particular genre, but a first foray into sort of this science fiction horror element. So maybe that was necessary to lay the groundwork for what Wells was trying to do. But I would have liked to have gotten to know Dr. Moreau more, because part of the assumption I think that's made with this story is that there is a value in knowledge, scientific knowledge, and Dr. Moreau reflects that scientific knowledge and gaining it regardless of the cost. Very Frankenstein, very Jurassic Park, right? Yeah. And so to have him be presented as sort of a good guy, and maybe that's what Montgomery was supposed to be there for, except that he never was. He was just sort of this wishy-washy character that didn't seem to serve any real purpose except to be the conduit by which Prendick gets to the island. Yeah, so I would have liked to have seen more of Dr. Moreau as surface-wise seeming like a reasonable, intelligent person, and then slowly, as you unravel the mystery, you realize that he's not.
Yeah.
I think that's what I would have liked.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I like that too, yeah.
Which kind of leads us to the theme.
Yeah.
Which I kind of already alluded to. But tell me what theme you pulled from this story.
Yeah, I got a few things. I think you cannot override the innate nature of animals was something that was presented. I don't think that's the main theme, but I think it's a theme in there. I think humans bear responsibility for the things they create is another theme. What you said, we should not pursue knowledge with no consideration for the cost, I think is a theme. And trying to play God with living beings will only yield horrific consequences, I think is a theme.
That's a good one.
I think it's a mix of things.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on thematically in this story.
Yeah, I agree. And that's one of the things that I think he does very well is Those themes are very clear. They're not in your face. So I guess they are sort of a little in your face, but not in a bad way. Don't feel like I'm being beaten over the head by it. But it's very clear, all of the themes that are available. And I would just add to the ones that you just said, again, with the theme about knowledge, is that what I wrote down was morality and ethics morality and ethics are more important than knowledge.
That's a good one.
And I should clarify, because there are stories that we know that where morality and ethics are completely supersede knowledge to the detriment. So there's a balance there.
Yeah.
Right? We can think of lots of stories where, let's just think about like the Salem witch trials right there. Morality and ethics, morality trumped knowledge like hugely, and then people died.
Right. Yeah.
There's the flip side of that. But in this particular case, this search for knowledge was not tempered with morality and ethics, and therefore it became a very bad thing. So as a writer, what do you take away from H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau?
For me, the thing is maintaining narrative drive. I wanted more of that. It ties into the main character or the protagonist being more agentive, which is something that I wanted here, and I felt the lack of. Sometimes you read a story and, it doesn't follow rules or follow the structure. It kind of seems to break every rule of storytelling, but it still works. So when something doesn't work, like I think there are things here that don't quite work, then then is when I look at the guidelines and see, okay, is there something in these guidelines that would have made this better? And I think in this case, I would have been more compelled if the character had been more agentive, and particularly if they had that agency in the climax. So that's my takeaway.
And my takeaway is, in addition to yours, a more well-developed villain to have his villainy unfold as the story progresses. I think that would have been really powerful and impactful, and I think that would be a good thing for me to do as a writer.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, that would have tied into mine as well. Like if he had seen the villainy increase, right? Where Prendick becomes more aware of what's going on, and then if he had like inspired the beasts to rebel or something, then that could have come to a head in a good climax and delivered that message, without specifically saying it, you would get it. I think that would have been more engaging, more exciting. And it doesn't have to be that, but I think those two things could have tied together in some way.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we talk about the story told in the movie Thunderbolts. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. This was good.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.